Human rights in Australia have largely been developed under Australian parliamentary democracy, through laws in specific contexts and safeguarded by such institutions as the independent judiciary and the High Court, which implement common law, the Australian Constitution, and various other laws of Australia and its states and territories. Australia also has an independent statutory human rights body, the Australian Human Rights Commission, which investigates and conciliates complaints, and more generally promotes human rights through education, discussion and reporting. Universal voting rights and rights to freedom of association, freedom of religion and freedom from discrimination are protected in Australia. The Australian colonies were among the first political entities in the world to grant universal manhood suffrage and female suffrage. Contemporary Australia is a liberal democracy and heir to a large post-World War II multicultural program of immigration in which forms of racial discrimination have been prohibited. As a founding member of the United Nations, Australia assisted in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it is signatory to various other international treaties on the subject of human rights. Australia is the only democratic country in the world without a national Bill of Rights of some kind. Racism in Australia traces both historical and contemporary racist community attitudes, as well as political non-compliance and alleged governmental negligence on United Nations human rights standard and incidents in Australia. An ongoing human rights issue in Australia is the legacy of mistreatment of Indigenous Australians, who are disproportionately of disadvantaged socio-economic standing, have shorter lifespans, and make up a disproportionately high number of imprisoned persons, thus receiving disproportionately high levels of social welfare payment as well as preferential employment and tertiary educational placement in state sectors. In 2016-17, the estimated direct expenditure per person was $44,886 for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, which was around twice the rate for non-Indigenous Australians. As Australia does not have a Bill of Rights to implement all international human rights, some states have implemented their own charters. For example, in Queensland, in Victoria, and in the ACT. As such, other sources of rights exist to protect rights in Australia. Human rights are protected under the Australian Constitution in several ways. In addition, as a result of certain structural implications and principles, the Constitution protects human rights indirectly through several means, including human rights are protected through various statutory enactments in a broad variety of specific contexts. For example, there are statutes which prescribe and regulate police powers, use of personal information, secret recording of conversations, equal treatment when buying goods and services, consumer rights, and many other statutes. The common law of Australia protects rights indirectly through various causes of action unless such an intention is outlined and manifested by clear language. This is known as the principle of legality, which acts as an extra layer of protection for human rights against vague or ambiguous legislation. Furthermore, former Chief Justice of New South Wales, James Spiegelman, has compiled a list of a number of rights-depriving acts which the common law presumes the legislature does not intend without clear wording, including retrospectively changing rights and obligations, infringing personal liberty, interfering with freedom of movement or speech, restricting access to the courts, interfering with vested property rights, and denying procedural fairness. In addition, there are various common law principles which afford certain protections, such as legal professional privilege, and the privilege against self-incrimination. Australia has signed various international treaties and conventions regarding human rights. Australia has agreed to be bound by the following treaties. Although Australia is a signatory to these, the rights given in the treaties are only applicable in Australia if domestic legislation is established. For example, the Racial Discrimination Act 1975 implements the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the Sex Discrimination Act 1984 provides some of the rights outlined in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of discrimination against women. However, another way the rights provided in a treaty can be seen in Australian law is where provisions of a treaty are already a part of domestic legislation. The Australian Human Rights Commission. It has responsibility for the investigation of alleged infringements under Australia's anti-discrimination legislation. Matters that can be investigated by the Commission include discrimination on the grounds of age, race, color or ethnic origin,